And when... Okay, today's lesson is lesson 2-3, subtract rational numbers. I switched pages on you. When we subtract rational numbers, you're going to do pretty much the same thing as adding, except that this time you're going to be subtracting. And the problem with this is when you are subtracting, you have to do that additive inverse. So I hope you remember what the additive inverse property is. The additive inverse property has you, if you look right here, turning that subtraction problem into an addition problem. And then on top of all of that, if you're dealing with fractions, you also have to get a common denominator. You have to make sure you have a common denominator, and you also have to make sure that you're paying attention to those rules of integers, because that also applies. And then even to add one more layer of something you have to keep track of, the last thing is you have to keep track of, you might have to regroup a fraction, which means, so for example, if I have 2 1/2, and I'm going to take away from, I'm going to take a, oops, no, I'm going to take away from that 3 halves. I have to change or take away or borrow from this 2. So this then becomes a 3, because 1/2 plus 2 halves, a whole, that whole that I borrowed is 2 halves, equals 3 halves. So that can be very, very confusing. So it's super important that you make sure that while you're doing this, that you are paying attention to those 3 things. So we're going to break those 3 things apart in little pieces to make sure that, to make sure that you understand. I wish I could just erase the whole thing. To make sure that you understand what you have to do. Okay? So let's start with the additive inverse property. All right? And we're going to look at, I think what we'll do is we're going to look at this problem here. Let's look at this problem here, number 1. Okay? So the first thing you have to do, there are steps that you have to do. Okay? Oops, I'm gonna, no, what am I doing here? I want to use a different color. This right here is step number 1. You have to add the opposite. So that's the additive inverse. Okay? So I have a -4 1/7 minus -6/7. And they put that like that so that you don't mess up that minus and that subtraction sign. We have to make this an addition problem. So this becomes a -4 1/7 plus, you add the opposite. The opposite of a -6/7 is a +6/7. Okay, that's step 1. Step 1 is the additive inverse property. You have to make sure that you do the additive inverse property. Okay, so that's step 1. Step 2. Step 2 is right here. That's step 2. Step 2 is you're going to want to write that improper fraction, or that mixed number, into a not so improper fraction if you have an or if you have a mixed number. Okay, so you have to do this if you have it. Okay, so in this case we have a -4. Oops, what the heck is going on here? We have a -4 1/7. So I need to turn that into a not so improper fraction. So 4 times 7 is 28, plus 1 is 29. So that's a -29/7. Okay? This 4, as we were just doing with the Cuisenaire rods, this 4 right here means 7/7 plus 7/7 plus 7/7 plus 7/7, right? Because that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Plus then your 1/7. So if you add those all up, 7 plus 7 is 14, plus 7 is 21, plus 7 is 28, plus 1 is 29. That's 29/7. Okay? That's how we get this. Or you take your 7, our denominator, times the number we have 1, 2, 3, 4, our whole number, we have 4 of them, and then add your 1, the extra one on, okay? All right, so that's how you have to do that, okay? So that was step 2. So step 1 is the additive inverse. Step 2 is if you have a mixed number, turning it into a not so improper fraction, okay? There's got to be an easier way to erase this, but I can't figure that out right now. Okay, so now our next step then is going to be our step 3. And our step 3 is going to be right here. Write your sum of the numerators over a common denominator. Okay, so we did that right here is our problem. Okay, so you're going to take a negative 29 over 7 plus 6 over 7, and you're going to rewrite that because we have those common denominators, negative 29 plus 6 all over 7. And then you're going to add. That would be our next step. Our step number, oops, I gotta get a different color here. Step number 4 then is to add. And you just add whatever you have for your numerator. So a negative 29 plus 6. Now this is the problem. When you add, you need to apply your rules of integers. Okay? So if you have a negative plus a positive, that means you're really going to subtract because the signs are different. If you have a positive plus a positive or a negative plus a negative, it's going to be the same. So this right here, these rules are the same ones that I just did on the previous video. Okay? So when you add these two together, you're going to end up with a negative 29 plus 6. Well, the absolute value of negative 29 is 29. The absolute value of 6 is 6. 29 minus 6 is 23. So our answer then is going to be a negative 23 over 7. Okay? Now, the problem with integers is that, and fractions, is you have all of these steps. Okay? So our step 4, now the last thing you have is your last final step, which is our step 5, which is converting that improper fraction into a mixed number. So that negative 23 over 7 into a mixed number. So it's in lowest terms. So 7 goes into 23 3 times, and you're left with 2 over 7, and it's negative because it starts negative, it ends negative. Okay? It's a lot to do, and I understand that it's a lot to do, and it can be very, 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 very confusing. But it's really important that you show all of those steps so that I can make sure that you understand what you're doing. If you skip steps, you will lose points, and I would hate to see that happen. Okay? Not when you know what you're doing. Oops. What am I doing? Okay. That won't erase for some reason. All right, so now you could also do the same thing, but do it right here with decimals. And that's going to be a lot easier because when you do it with decimals, really the only thing you're going to have to do is this part right here, the add the opposite, because I let you use a calculator. And in decimals, you can go straight across. So here, you would turn this into 12.8 plus the opposite of 21.6 is a negative 21.6. And then you would just add those together, and you can use a calculator. Now, if you don't have a calculator, again, just like I said in the previous video, you just line up those decimal points, but you don't need to worry about that. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to go through a problem. I want to see what you can do, okay? And again, lots of steps. I hope you wrote all those steps down, okay? All right, so I think what I'm going to ask you to do right now is I'm going to ask you to pause your computer, and I'm going to ask you to do, let's see. I want to do 2 problems. So let's do number 1. Let's do an easy one. And then also let's do number 2. 1 and 2. Pause your computer, do number 1 and 2, and then come back. Okay? Okay, numbers 1 and 2. Number 1. Why does it keep doing that? I don't know what I'm doing here. Number 1. Number 1 is 1/3 minus a negative 1/3. Okay? So I have to, first step, additive inverse property, add the opposite. So 1/3 plus the opposite of a negative 1/3 is a positive 1/3. Second step, you need to find a common denominator. We already have a common denominator, so I don't have to do anything other than my third step now. My next step is to write it as a fraction with your numerators, an addition problem with your numerators on top over one denominator. And then my next step is to add using the rules of integers. Well, 1 plus 1 is 2, all over 3. That would be my answer. There are no integers to deal with, so that's it. We're done. Okay, there's no simplifying that you need to do, so you're good. So that's number 1. Okay, let's do number 2. Oops. I'm having issues here now. Ooh, what did I just do? Can't remember what size my thing was. Having problems erasing things today. Okay. So number 2, I think I'm just going to do this to get rid of these, so I can have a free space to do your number 2. Alrighty, here we go. Ooh, I went a little too far. Too many. What the heck am I? I'm having real issues with this video program today. Okay, here we go. There we go. All right, number 2. Number 2 is, gosh, I can't win. Number 2 is a negative. Ooh. Negative 3 1/3 minus 5/6. Okay, step 1, rewrite this using the additive inverse property, adding the opposite. So your first fraction stays the same, negative 3 1/3. You're going to add the opposite of 5/6, which is a negative 5/6. Okay? Step 2, you need to get a common denominator. Okay, our denominators are 3 and 6. So you could do your LCD, your least common denominator, or you could find a larger denominator. Your least common denominator is 6. So what you're going to do is you have to, this one's fine, the second fraction's fine, but you're going to have to do this, change this fraction a little bit here to make it 6. Now you could do this improper fraction prior to getting a common denominator, or you could do it after. I'm going to do it after. So if I have, I need to turn this 3 right here into a 6, I do that by multiplying it by 2, because 3 times 2, if I have, I'm going to write it over here, I'm going to write it in light blue over here. If I have 3 1/3, okay, I need to turn this 1/3 into 6's. So what do I do to that 3 to make it a 6? I multiplied it by 2. So I got to do the same thing up there. I got to multiply it times 2. So that ends up being a 2. So it's 3 now. Bring your 3 over. 3 2/6. Okay? All right, 3 2/6. I just want to delete these little lines that I just did here. Okay, so if I have 3 1/3, we said was a negative 3 2/6 plus negative 5/6. Okay, so now we got our common denominator. Now you got to make an improper fraction. So there's a couple things you could do. Now, there are so many ways to solve math problems. I understand that in the past they've taught you to turn this into an improper fraction. The thing is, if you're going to add, because your signs are both of your signs are negative, you have a negative, and when you're adding and you have the signs the same, you're just adding, you're not really subtracting. So if that's the case, if you're just adding and you're not subtracting, I would just add. I wouldn't change it into an improper fraction because you're just going to have to do more work. So this would become, you just add, well, you do this, you take your -3, I would separate them. I'd go -3 plus, and then -2 plus -5 all over 6. Okay, so this -2 plus -5 is going to be a -7 over 6, and then you're going to add on that -3. So -7 over 6 with a -3 in front. Oops, 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 oops. So it would be, and you don't have to necessarily add that like I did, but you could do it improper. You don't have to, though, I guess is what I'm saying. It's up to you, whatever works best for you. So this would be then a -3 and 7/6. But this 7/6 is improper. So this is 6/6 plus 1/6. So 6/6 is 1. So that's a -4 then, and 1/6. That would be your answer. If you got that answer correct, showing that work, then you can move on. If you are not showing all of your work, that is not going to work. Okay? Okay, let's move on to the next. All right, here we go. So now there's also one other thing that you have to do in this lesson, and that is calculating your distance. Okay? So when you calculate your distance, when you're finding your distance, you have to find the distance between two numbers on a number line. And because it's distance, we've talked about this I don't know how many times this year, because it's distance, distance is always positive. So you're going to be dealing with the absolute values again. Okay, so you're going to look here and you have the problem of a -2 and 2/3 and a negative and a -2 and positive 2 and 1/3. Okay, so you're gonna you want to make it so that you can find your distance between the two. So I am personally not a fan of the way that they set this up. They took a -2 and 2/3 minus a negative, or -2 and 1/3, which is going to give you a negative. Now, you know, if it's distance, it can't be negative, so your answer has to be positive. But you could also, instead of doing that, you could reset up this problem and make it, instead of the negative first, start with your positive. So your positive would be 2 and 1/3 minus a -2 and 2/3, right? And then this then would become 2 and 1/3 plus the opposite of a -2 and 2/3 is 2 and 2/3. And then you're going to end up with a positive answer. And then you're going to follow your same rules. You're going to do exactly what we've been doing. You're going to get the common denominator, additive inverse, common denominator, subtract or add, and then get your answer. So your answer here was -5. Okay, this next problem, number 4, is trying to apply this to something that you would do in real life. And again, just like the previous lesson, when you have a real life situation, almost always when you're talking about rational numbers, it's going to be decimals that you're going to be dealing with. Okay? So in this case, they talk about below the surface a boat is, and the trailer size and all of that good stuff, and passing under a bridge, and essentially you're creating a subtraction problem. And because it's distance, it is distance, it's got to be positive. So again, that positive comes first and the negative comes second, so that you can turn that negative into a positive. We've been doing that all the way through integers. Okay, but I'm going to practice one. So we're going to do number 7 together. All right, let's do number 7. Okay, so number 7 says find the distance between a negative 7.5 and a negative 15.3. Okay, so if I have a negative 7.5 and a negative 15.3, it's distance, so you're going to want it to be positive, right? So whichever is the larger number is going, you want to be second, so that because they're both negative, so that you end up with a positive answer. So a negative 7.5 minus a negative 15.3 is your subtraction problem. And now you need to turn that into an addition problem using the additive inverse. So that is negative 7.5 plus the opposite of a negative 15.3 is a positive 15.3. Now our signs are different, and when our signs are different, you're going to add, not subtract. Okay? So now what you need to do is you need to subtract 7.5 from 15.3. So I don't have a calculator with me right now, so we're going to do this in the traditional method so that if you don't have a calculator, you can, well, it'll refresh your memory of how to do that. So 15.3, and you're going to subtract from that 7.5. So you line up your decimal. Okay, and then you're going to have to do some regrouping. So this, you have to regroup and make that then a 13. You're taking that 10 from the 5 and putting it over here into the 3, so now you have 13. So 13 minus, and this really should be helpful with our number talks. 13 minus 5 is 6, and then 4 minus 7, I can't do that, but I don't really need to worry about it. I could just do this whole number right here, 14. 14 minus 7 is 7. So my answer is 7.6. Okay? All right. Done. I do think I want to go over one more problem.